Welcome to the Quiet Hours. You can get new episodes a week early and ad-free by becoming a subscriber. Just follow the links in the episode description. Find a place to rest, your bed, your favorite chair, anywhere soft and quiet. Settle in and let your shoulders sink. There's nothing you need to do, nothing you need to solve. Take a deep breath in and let it go. With each breath, the day grows further away. You're about to enter a story about books, time, and the small wonders that hide between pages. A man named Jacob will soon find himself in a library where the boundaries between past and present blur. A place where opening a book can open an entire moment in history. Each turn of the page will come like the rhythm of your breathing, slow, steady, unhurried. Let the quiet of the library fill your imagination, the soft rustle of paper, the warm scent of wood and ink. And as Jacob begins his journey through time, allow yourself to drift wherever your thoughts wish to go. There's no need to stay awake for the ending. The story, like time itself, will keep unfolding, gently, endlessly, just beyond the edge of sleep. Jacob had never walked down that street before. At least he didn't think he had. It was narrow and unassuming, tucked between taller buildings like a crease in a folded map. By day, he might have passed it without noticing. Tonight, though, the lamps along the cobbles glowed softly, leading him inward. The evening air was cool and the town felt as if it had loosened its collar and exhaled, relieved of its bustle. He walked without hurry, the kind of aimless stride that makes room for small discoveries. The houses leaned close on either side of the lane, their eaves dim against the sky. He noticed little things, the carved initials on a lintel, a child's toy wedged behind a step, the faded advertisement for a fair from years ago pasted to a post and curling at the edges. These details gave the place a quiet, lived-in feeling, as if it were held together by memory as much as by brick. At the lane's end stood a building he didn't recognize. It was solid and calm, its doors tall and wooden with iron handles shaped like question marks. Above the lintel, letters carved into stone read, "A time for reading." Jacob paused. The name felt like an invitation. He pressed his palm to the cool iron, and the door swung inward as though it had been waiting for him all along. Inside, the air smelled of paper and polished wood with a faint hint of lavender. Light fell in soft shafts from high windows, catching the dust motes that drifted lazily. Rows of shelves rose like quiet cliffs into the warm gloom, filled with books of all sizes and ages. Some spines were gilded and proud, others soft with use, their titles rubbed down to simple traces. A few boasted nothing at all but plain cloth, waiting. Near the entrance, at a desk carved with flourishes of leaves and time-worn hands, sat the librarian. They were smaller than Jacob had expected, neither severe nor overly familiar, simply a presence in which the library itself seemed to breathe. Silvered hair, slow, steady movements. They glanced up as Jacob passed beneath the lintel and gave, not a greeting so much as a small, appraising nod. "Good evening," Jacob offered, and the word felt too loud for the hush. "Good evening," the librarian replied, voice low as if tuned to the room. Their eyes rested on him for a moment longer. Then they returned to a ledger on the desk. No need to explain, no question to meet him with. The silence implied permission. "Wander if you wish." Jacob hesitated by the first aisle, fingertips grazing spines. The titles were a map of possibilities: first snow, long journeys, names of doors. Dust made soft halos where his fingers passed. He wandered deeper, following the slow architecture of the place, and found himself noticing more. The small ladder with brass rings, the way some shelves bowed under the weight of themselves, the tiny notes tucked into pages like paper whispers. When his hand paused on a narrow, time-darkened volume, his curiosity sharpened. The book had no title on its spine, only the soft sheen of age. He drew it free. The pages smelled faintly of beeswax and rain. The letters on the open page trembled in the lamplight, as if they were not entirely settled yet. Jacob touched them, and for a single breath, the world tilted. Before he could name what had happened, the library dissolved. A beating of his heart, that was all he noticed at first. Then the distant stir of voices, the rustle of other lives. He had not planned to leave his street, yet here he was, somewhere else entirely. When he came back to himself, the book lay in his lap, ordinary as any book, quiet and still. He slid it gently back into its place and turned to leave. The librarian watched him, eyes soft. As Jacob approached the desk, the older figure folded the ledger closed and rose, moving with a careful economy that suggested practice and patience. "You found something," the librarian said. Not a question, but an observation, the kind that welcomes truth. Jacob swallowed. I saw a market." Words scrambled, too sudden to make neat. It felt like a painting, but it was a real place. The librarian's gaze crinkled at the corners. "Many books keep small worlds, and some of those worlds keep small truths," they said quietly. "If you wish to explore them, take your time." Their hand brushed a small strip of paper from the desk and pushed it toward him, a thin bookmark, plain, with a single word printed in an elegant faded type. "Listen." Jacob took it, thumb tracing the paper. The librarian's gesture felt like a benediction, encouraging, not directive. They did not say what the books did or how to step carefully. They only gave him that single word and the sense that the room would hold whatever he asked of it. He inclined his head, grateful and slightly unsettled, then wandered deeper among the shelves. The hush wrapped around him like a cloak. He turned another page. The air tilted again. The square smelled of baking bread. The scent wrapped him like a familiar scarf. Voices rose and fell, not loud but full, vendors calling names, children playing, merchants bargaining in warm, blunt tones. Jacob's heart beat a little faster with the richness of it all. He had arrived in the morning. Light was thin and silver, and the market was opening into motion. Stalls were heaped with goods, brass pots that shone like small moons, bolts of cloth in muted patterns, baskets of pears half hidden by paper. The cobbles underfoot were uneven and furred at the edges with moss and spilled straw, and every sound had a small, bright clarity. The ring of a cart's harness, the slap of a hand against a crate, the creak of leather as a sack was hauled. Jacob moved among them like someone stepping through a memory that belonged to someone else. A woman sold loaves that steamed in the cool air. He watched her work with a small, private wonder, noticing the exactitude of her hands. He saw a potter shaping clay, fingers moving with the patient knowledge of habit. A boy with a cap too big for his head toppled from a crate and burst into delighted, pleading laughter, which made people near him grin and shake their heads in indulgence. He wandered until he came to a stall draped with faded maps and hand-drawn charts. The seller, an older man with a face full of fine creases, unfolded a map with a flourish and offered it to a customer. The map's ink was already worn where hands had traced routes many times. Jacob found himself leaning closer than he intended, drawn by lines that seemed to know the curves of roads he walked now. A thread of recognition tugged at him, like the ghost of a street he'd taken for granted in his own life. A small sound pulled him away. A music box at a child's stall, turning its gears and letting out a tinny, bright melody. It reminded him of something from his childhood, of afternoons spent with a particular tune, of a window slightly open in summer while a neighbor played something simple and persistent. He felt the memory press soft and sweet into him, then recede again as if sharing its presence and moving on. He stood, hands in his pockets, and watched the world flow. No one seemed to notice him. He had the strange privacy of an invisible observer. He passed a stationer arranging quills beside ink pots, and a sign cradled behind the counter announced a writing contest for the fair. It nudged at him, an echo perhaps of the later book he would choose, but he did not notice then. He was only present to the textures and smells of the scene. A little girl tumbled past and knocked his boot. She apologized in a bright voice, and seeing the confusion on his face, offered him a crooked smile as if to say, "You look surprised by life." A moment of connection, small, ordinary, resonant. Jacob smiled back and felt a warmth, a gentle settling inside that was not there when he had come in. Time in that place did not feel like a chain pressing him forward. It felt like an accumulation of small moments laid end to end. He watched a lamplighter pause to lift his ladder against a post and strike a match with a practiced motion, bringing a warm feather of light to the topmost pane. The glow spread, catching on the wet stone, and for an instant the square shimmered with a golden patience that made Jacob ache with longing and gratitude. He reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the rim of a wooden stall. The grain was cool and reassuring. The touch anchored him. He thought about how quickly the scene around him might close up, how a blink could dissolve it into memory. That thought made him savor every detail, the curve of a woman's scarf, the careful crease of a hat, the wet shine of a horse's flank. And then, as though someone had turned a soft, invisible wheel, the market thinned. Colors bled at the edges. Voices drew back like tides. A hush crept in from the periphery. Jacob felt the air lift and shift, as if the world were gathering itself into a held breath. He blinked, and the cobbles and the vendors and the music box were gone. He stood again in the hush of the library, the narrow book closed and heavy in his palms. The scent of bread and smoke had been replaced by dust and lavender. His heartbeat was audible in his ears for a long moment. From the desk, the librarian watched him. Their eyes were calm, and this time there was a small, almost imperceptible smile at the corner of their mouth. It was not an explanation. It was not a lecture. It was a look that suggested, "You found it, you saw. What you do with it is yours." Jacob slid the book back into its place with hands that felt a little different, steadier, softened by what he'd touched. He had been a stranger to his own history a short hour ago. Now a thread had been handed to him. Standing by the shelf, he turned and looked at the librarian and, as if compelled, said, "Thank you." The librarian inclined their head. They did not speak of doors or rules. They only folded the ledger closed and gestured with a slight, unshowy motion toward the stacks, as though offering the whole room to him again. Jacob stepped away, a careful plan knitting itself inside him. Next time, he would choose. He would not open a book by accident. He would pick one with intention. The library felt larger than before, not in size but in possibility. He had had a taste of other times. Now he wanted an answer, or at least a deeper visit to something that might mean more. He tucked the word "listen," the bookmark the librarian had slid him, between thumb and palm, and felt its thin paper steady him. Then, quite simply, he walked on. Jacob didn't rush. He walked the aisles slowly, his hands resting lightly on the spines of the books, as though each might whisper to him if he only lingered long enough. The memory of the marketplace clung to him. The smell of bread, the sound of laughter, the colors blurring into silence. It hadn't been frightening, not really, but it had been sudden, like falling into a stream before you'd decided to swim. This time, he thought, he would choose more carefully. The shelves stretched endlessly, or nearly so. Some books seemed to hum faintly in his fingers, though perhaps it was only his imagination. He paused often, pulling a volume halfway free, then sliding it back again. He had the oddest sense that if he chose carelessly, he might end up anywhere: a battlefield, a storm, some forgotten wilderness. That wasn't what he wanted. Not tonight. Eventually, he found himself in a narrow aisle where the light from a high window fell soft and golden. Dust turned in the air like drifting snowflakes. There, a single book caught his eye. It was neither large nor ornate. Its cover was simple, leather-worn thin, the color of faded earth. What made him pause was the title pressed faintly into the spine: Home, 1871. Jacob reached out and brushed the letters with his fingertips. The word home stirred something inside him, a mixture of comfort and curiosity. He lived in a modern town now, but the year printed there, it belonged to the history of this same place. He was sure of it. Perhaps he would see streets he knew, changed and strange in their youth. He slid the book free, its weight balanced and solid in his hands. For a long moment, he simply held it, listening to the quiet all around. Then he opened it. The shift was smoother this time, less like stumbling and more like stepping gently through a doorway. The library melted away, and a cool breeze touched his face. When his eyes cleared, Jacob was standing at the edge of a narrow lane. Houses leaned close on either side, their brickwork darkened with soot, their windows small and glinting. The street felt familiar and unfamiliar at once. He thought, yes, if he walked just a little further, he would find the square where a modern cafe stood, where he'd once met friends after work. But now the square was filled with wagons and coal carts. Children darted between them, their boots splashing through puddles. A lamplighter was making his way down the row, ladder balanced on his shoulder, pausing at each post to coax a flame into being. Jacob's breath caught in his chest. He had stepped into his own town but a century and a half earlier. He moved slowly, trying not to look too bewildered, though no one seemed to pay him much attention. The cobbles rang underfoot. He passed a shop with its door open, spilling out the smell of tobacco and ink. A woman leaned from a window above, shaking crumbs from a cloth. It was ordinary life, unfolding as it always had, yet it was extraordinary to him. The hum of existence carried on, unchanged by the fact that he was watching from far beyond its years. For the first time, Jacob felt the weight of what the books could do. Not just glimpses of faraway ages, but threads of his own story, his own place, stretched across time. He stood still in the lamplight, letting the realization sink into him. Jacob wandered slowly through the lamplit streets, each step measured, as if walking too quickly might tear the delicate thread that held him here. The town felt at once foreign and familiar, like a dream stitched from scraps of memory. He knew these turns, these cobbled alleys, but their faces were younger, rougher, cloaked in the breath of another age. The air was sharp with coal smoke and damp stone. Somewhere, a dog barked, the sound carrying down the narrow lanes. Lanterns swung gently on their posts, halos of light trembling against the darkness. Jacob turned a corner and found himself beside the river. The water glimmered, catching the glow from the lamplighter's pole as he coaxed flame into a lantern along the bank. A barge moved slowly through the dark current, its shape hulking and low, guided by a man who leaned into his pole with patient strength. Jacob leaned on the worn wooden rail and breathed in the cool dampness rising from the water. He thought of how many times he'd stood by this river in his own time, watching its surface ripple with reflections of neon signs, bridges thrumming with cars. Here, though, it was quieter. He could almost hear the rhythm of oars dipping, the creak of wood, the distant call of someone unseen. Leaving the river, he let his feet guide him. He passed a row of cottages with thatched roofs, smoke rising in thin ribbons from their chimneys. At one, a door stood open, and he glimpsed a family gathered around a table, their faces lit by a single lamp. A child laughed a high, bright sound, and Jacob felt his chest ache with a tender recognition. The moment was ordinary, unremarkable, but it carried the same heartbeat as the evenings of his own life. He walked further, and the cobbles led him into the square. It was busy still, though the stalls were beginning to close. Merchants packed away baskets of fruit, folding canvas covers over their goods. A man lifted a crate of apples, his back straining, while a young girl chased after a runaway one that rolled toward Jacob's boots. She scooped it up, smiled shyly at him, then darted back to her father's side without a word. Jacob lingered, taking it all in, the rhythm of a place alive with its own simple continuance. He thought about how, to them, this was nothing extraordinary. It was only life, carrying forward. But to him, it was a glimpse through a window he hadn't known existed, a reminder that his world was layered upon theirs, one generation built upon another. It was then that he noticed the shop at the edge of the square. Its crooked sign read, "Bookseller and Stationer." Drawn by some instinct he couldn't name, Jacob stepped closer. Through the window's wavy glass, he saw shelves lined with ledgers, jars of ink, neat stacks of paper, and at the counter sat a boy, The boy bent over a sheet, pen scratching as he wrote. His brow was furrowed, his mouth pressed into the shape of concentration. Something about him tugged at Jacob, the tilt of his head, the restless fingers smudged faintly with ink. They seemed achingly familiar. Jacob leaned closer to the glass. The boy paused, sensing perhaps that he was being watched, and lifted his gaze. Their eyes met. The moment was sharp, almost startling. The boy's face was not Jacob's, not exactly, but it carried echoes. The same slope of the nose, the same searching look in the eyes. Jacob felt his breath catch. It was like glimpsing himself in the distance of time. The boy blinked, puzzled, then returned to his writing. Jacob stayed, watching the careful strokes of the pen. He wondered what words were being written. A school assignment, perhaps, or a letter to someone far away. A thought came to him that these very words, or the habit of writing itself, might ripple forward, passed down in ways invisible until they reached him, until they became part of the man he was. He pressed a hand against the cool glass, not to knock, not to disturb, only to anchor himself to the reality of the moment. Then, with a soft breath, he stepped back. Some connections, he thought, were not meant to be spoken. Some were enough simply to feel. He turned once more into the streets, carrying the image of the boy with him. The square had grown quieter, the lanterns brighter in the deepening dusk. Jacob walked for a while longer, letting the details sink into him. The call of a vendor selling his last loaf of bread, the flicker of a moth around a lamp, the uneven stones beneath his boots. And then it came, the gentle tug, the shimmer at the edge of the air. The past began to soften around him, like ink dissolving in water. Lanterns blurred, voices thinned to whispers. The scent of coal and bread faded into the faint sweetness of dust and lavender. When Jacob blinked, he was back in the library. The book was closed in his hands. His breath came slow, his heart full. The librarian lifted their gaze from the ledger, meeting his eyes once again. There was no smile, no word, only the steady presence of someone who understood. Jacob replaced the book carefully on its shelf. He stood for a while in the hush, letting the silence press gently around him, the memory of lamplight and ink-stained fingers still glowing softly in his mind. Jacob stood for a long while in the hush of the library, the book still warm in his hands. The lamplight and cobblestones of the past seemed to linger in his chest like an echo that would never quite fade. Slowly, he placed the volume back into its gap on the shelf, his fingertips trailing along the spine as if to thank it for opening. When he turned, the librarian was watching him. They had risen from their desk and stood a little way off, hands folded loosely, their expression calm but intent. Jacob felt for the first time that he should speak. "I saw my town," he said softly, unsure if his voice belonged in such a quiet place. How it was before, people living their lives, children laughing, a boy who... He hesitated, then allowed the truth to slip out. "I think he was family, maybe a part of me carried forward." The librarian's eyes warmed. They said nothing at first, only listened, as if each word Jacob spoke was worth holding carefully. Then, in a voice as low and measured as the rustle of pages, they answered, "The books open to those who are ready to read them. Nothing shown is ever wasted. Jacob let the words settle. They weren't an explanation, not really, but they felt true. He found himself nodding. I feel less alone, he admitted. The librarian's lips curved, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement. They inclined their head as though to say, "Then you have learned what you needed." For a moment they stood in silence together, the air carrying only the faint scent of lavender and ink. Then the librarian lifted a hand, a gesture neither urgent nor dismissive, but gentle, a permission, perhaps, or a blessing. Jacob understood. It was time to go. He walked toward the great doors, each step unhurried. As he pushed them open, the cool breath of dawn touched his face. The night had thinned, and the sky glowed faintly gold at the edges. He glanced back once. The librarian still stood among the shelves, tall and still, framed by the drifting dust and the quiet light. Their presence felt like part of the library itself, timeless, watchful, kind. Jacob dipped his head in gratitude. The librarian inclined theirs in return. Then he stepped outside. The street was hushed, the lamps paling as the first birds stirred in the eaves. Jacob breathed deeply, the air fresh with morning. His heart carried the weight of what he'd seen, but it was no longer a heavy weight. It was grounding, steadying, a reminder that he belonged to something far larger than himself. As he walked toward the brighter end of the street, the rooftops bathed in sunrise. He felt the quiet certainty of having been changed. The memory of shelves and of the calm figure who guarded them would remain with him, a secret map he could carry wherever he went.
Come smoke with me. Come
You get
smoke
it?
with me.
I smoke right.
You didn't text me anything? Let me check.
Yes, I will smoke it.
Come smoke with me. You can come. Come, Frank. Join.
Yeah. Salt.
Ian is our trusted person didn't text me or anything?
Yes, I will